The Red Cross says that the international community has morally failed to address the Israel-Hamas war. The comments come amid another delayed vote in the United Nations Security Council on a potential ceasefire in Gaza. Diplomats have been in talks to convince the United States, which is a staunch backer of Israel, not to veto the resolution tonight. U.S. President Joe Biden's administration has already vetoed 3 previous resolutions. Nearly 20,000 Palestinians have been killed since Israel started bombing Gaza in October. That was in response to attacks by the Palestinian armed group Hamas, which killed 1,200 people in Israel and took more than 200 hostages on October 7th.
We have a situation that happens under our watch. I have started speaking of moral failure because every day this continues will be a day more where the international community hasn't proven capable of ending such high levels of suffering, and this will have an impact on generations, not only in Gaza but beyond Gaza. Nothing can happen without an agreement by both sides. There are certain modalities that need to be negotiated by them through intermediaries. That can be Qatar, and actually at the moment is Qatar. They have to agree on the steps, on the whereabouts where we can access the hostages, and we require the security guarantees. Events over the weekend have shown you that it's not only about our own security, our own staff, it is about the security of the hostages. And that is a given. There's no way around this. There's no silver bullet.
Well, let's get your live update then on the United Nations Security Council vote on a resolution that could lead to some form of pausing the fighting in Gaza. Bring in Voice of America correspondent Haydé Adams. Haydé, a very good evening to you. You're joining us from D.C. tonight. This vote postponed twice this week. Let's talk about why that is. And as I understand it, it's to do with the language, the phrasing of the resolution.
Tembekile, you are correct, and all eyes are, of course, especially here in Washington, all eyes are on the United Nations in New York to see whether the UN Security Council will finally vote on this resolution. They're mulling this proposal that demands a cessation of hostilities between Israel and Hamas to allow aid access to the Gaza Strip via land, sea and air routes, as well as to set up UN monitoring of the humanitarian aid that is being delivered to Gaza. Now, the main sticking point at the UN, as you said, is the text of the proposal that they're supposed to vote on. And for months now, that has been essentially the story at the UN over the Israel-Hamas war, disagreements over wording, and the US vetoing resolutions that don't contain the particular text that they don't agree with. And it's the wording around the following: lasting cessation of hostilities. That seems to be the problem. The U.S. had wanted to see the words suspension of hostilities. And the United States and Israel oppose an all-out ceasefire because they say that would only benefit Hamas. And so Washington says it supports pauses in fighting is what it says. So, this has been going on for quite a while now. The wording around pausing in fighting, the United States says it's meant to protect civilians and allow the release of hostages taken by Hamas from Israel on October 7th. The Americans want something similar to that 7-day pause we saw last month, during which Hamas released some hostages. The Israelis released some of the Palestinians they had been holding in their prisons. And during that time, we saw a lot more aid going into Gaza. So that is sort of what the U.S. wants. But that pause ended on December 1st, and we saw fighting, of course, resume again. So those are the sticking points right now at the UN Security Council. Last week, just very quickly, the UN General Assembly demanded a ceasefire with 153 out of 193 countries voting in favor of one. But of course, that kind of vote is not legally binding. Only UN Security Council votes and vetoes are binding. That's what matters here. And for that to happen, you need at least 9 votes in favor, no vetoes by either the US, France, China, Britain or Russia.
So, Haydé, what then are the expectations ahead of this vote tonight, given how split the member countries are? The Americans and the rest of the Western allies still firmly behind Israel, as was affirmed by Lord Austin, the U.S. Defense Secretary, during a trip to Tel Aviv just this week, and the Arab countries saying they want to see something happen immediately for the sake of the many Palestinians killed in this war.
You know, the word immediately has become such a, just a strange word these days, because what I think, if this vote does not happen tonight, or even if it does happen on this resolution, what you can expect is still more back and forth. If the aim here is to go for pauses and suspension of hostilities and not a ceasefire, then we can be right back here again in a few weeks' time with more votes and more vetoes over how to address this conflict. Now, earlier I said the UN General Assembly votes are not legally binding, unlike those taken at the UN Security Council. But General Assembly votes are a barometer of sorts to give us a sense of where international opinion stands and to gauge where member countries are on the matter. And so far, these General Assembly votes show there is a broadening and by some extent, a hardening of consensus for a ceasefire in this war. It's making the United States, which has so far been a rock-solid supporter of Israel, look increasingly isolated on the world stage. It leaves President Joe Biden increasingly exposed internationally and at home, especially as he enters an election year. And the U.S. has been trying to urge Israel to take a more targeted approach in Gaza. They're worried about the intensity of Israel's military campaign there. But the Biden administration officials have been pressing their Israeli counterparts to start planning now for a post-war Gaza. The Americans want to keep the idea of a two-state solution on the table. They say they're going to reject any proposal that involves Israeli control over Gaza, and they're against any ideas about reducing the size of the Palestinian territory. At the same time, you know, these dynamics are raising questions among analysts and observers here in the United States about what Benjamin Netanyahu's endgame is here, what his own political aspirations are, and whether he really cares what America thinks. Look, he has dealt with and outlasted other U.S. presidents. And so President Biden wants Netanyahu to change strategy, change tactic, but at the same time, the United States is still pledging unshakable support for Israel, even as it continues to pledge and give billions of dollars in military aid to Israel.
You mentioned the Biden administration. Of course, what Joe Biden does is also affecting polling, which is critical for him ahead of the 2024 elections in the U.S., where Donald Trump, the former president, is expected, to be his main Republican challenger. I'm curious about the tone of the conversation about what is going on in Gaza currently, continuing U.S. support for Israel, which is funding the war in particular, and how that may factor into what the Biden administration decides going forward.
Well, yes, it's not just about tone, but it is also about the toll that it's taking. Look, as you said, election season is upon us here in the United States. We're just under a year to go now before Americans go to the ballot box. And a New York Times Siena poll is showing that only 1/3 of registered American voters approve of President Biden's handling of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Among voters younger than 30, listen to this, 45% say they disapprove of the president's handling of the conflict. They say he is too supportive of Israel. And this survey highlights a sort of generational divide here, but also the difference in general among Americans over what the best course of action should be in this war. Analysts say this has the potential to shape not just the outcome of the next election, but of U.S. politics as a whole. And divisions in American society run deep over this war, from university campuses to workplaces to city streets around the country. And here in Washington on Capitol Hill, Democrats in Congress, they're growing increasingly vocal in their criticism of Israel's war with Hamas. This week, we saw a group of House Democrats with national security backgrounds. They sent a letter to President Biden arguing that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's military strategy in Gaza is not in the best interest of the United States, nor in the best interest of Israel's own security. But this war has led to a rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia here in the U.S. The Anti-Defamation League, which is a civil rights group here, released a report showing that anti-Semitic incidents in the United States is up 337% since the start of the Israel-Hamas war. The Council on American Islamic Relations, which is the nation's largest Muslim civil rights advocacy group, they say they've seen a 172% increase in Islamophobic attacks and bias. That's right, compared to this time last year. So that's the kind of pressure President Biden is under. Both Jewish and Muslim voters voters have enough votes that they can swing presidential races in key battleground states. So as we know with every election, turnout is what matters. Turnout is especially important in battleground states, and turnout is in large part what decides who ends up in the White House.
Haydé Adams, Voice of America correspondent, really good to speak to you. Thank you for that update.